they seem to be confused as to why blacks would be fleeing to the Republican Party at the level that they are. I mean, the latest polling coming out saying 22% of black Americans intend to vote for Trump rather than Biden in this next election is massive. It was 12% in the 2020 election, and now it's up to 22%. That's not a small bump. That's enough. That election was so close that is definitely enough to, Georgia would no longer be in play. It seems like that would potentially go for Trump this next time around rather than for Biden if things continue to go the way they are. So this is quite consequential that people understand the psyche, I think, of Black America and why the vote has stuck with the Democratic Party, and then also why the vote might be leaving for the Republican Party. I want to point out one thing I didn't mention when I was introducing you is that you're also a columnist. You've been writing all of these great articles that have appeared in USA Today and Wall Street Journal. One article in particular, I want to read from it a little bit, but this you wrote for Arrow. It looks Arrow magazine. Called
Arrow,
The Pivotal Irony of American Racism. And I want to bring this up because I think this is important for understanding why the black vote has been Democrat, why it's moving to Republican, but also why Republicans might not hold on to the black vote either. There's this, there's a real problem that I think needs to be addressed here. But you wrote, the fact of racism in America is quickly disappearing, but the legacy of racism is on the rise. So you write about this. First, so you're saying that racism is going away. We don't see so much racism anymore. We don't have segregation anymore. We don't have slavery. We don't have these, we have integrated schools. And so we're not seeing the same racism, systemic racism. We're also not seeing the same, I think, interpersonal racism. There's a lot of mixed race. You and I are both mixed race people. Both of us half white, I'm half Asian, you're half black. We're seeing more and more of that in society. But you also go on to write, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit, progressives attribute the state of affairs in black life to the inequitable impact of legal, economic, and other systems. Conservatives stress culture, personal responsibility, and the fact that many young black men in particular choose to commit crimes rather than marry, work, and raise children. So this is an interesting point because you're right, there is a lot to how Democrats have positioned themselves for black voters for many decades. And that is, hey, listen, blacks are disadvantaged. There's racism. It's built into the system. It's built into society. And it's difficult to overcome. So we need programs in order to overcome, to level out the playing field. It's kind of been the message for all these decades, right? Like we got affirmative action to level out the playing field. Conservatives, on the other hand, say, no, it should be a meritocracy. And the reason why you're not doing well, and it's not because of these systemic issues that are just holding you back. Those things are gone. It's instead culture. You need to have personal responsibility in your culture. Get married. Don't commit crime. Don't shoot people. Get a job, right? That's what you actually said in a different article you wrote about polarization in America does not exist laterally between the parties. You say that there's a diagonal polarization from elites in each party. You've got the elites in each party and then the poor in each party. And there's this also divide within the parties. But one thing you said in there was when poor whites hear liberal politicians, pundits, and professors talk about white privilege and the ignorance of Trump voters, they feel the same revulsion that black Americans feel when confronted with the chidings of elite conservatives who say that black people's problems would be solved if they would just simply stop shooting each other and find a job, right? So it goes to that culture. Right. So you've got Republicans saying it's cultural problem, and you've got Democrats saying it's a systemic problem. What do you think it is?
Right. So that was great. That is your brain on polarization, basically, because what it means is that you're not able to take the tension that exists with a coin having two sides to it, right? And recognizing the fact that it is still one coin. And so, in short, the answer is that it is both. Now, the question becomes, what is the interrelationship between systems and culture? By the way, let me just say on racism, the devil is in the definitions, right? Because I think the way I wrote about it is to say that as you quoted me as saying, the reality of racism is diminishing, but the legacy of racism is rising.
Right.
And but of course, all this is a question of how you're defining racism. Interpersonal racism is definitely diminishing, and overt, explicit, systematic racism of the Jim Crow variety, whose clear and conscious goal is to sort of subdue certain racial groups in the interest of others, namely white people, that's diminishing. But, if you were to define systemic racism as not necessarily being conscious, but nevertheless existing in the interrelationship between systems and institutions that maybe were begun in a racist way or subconsciously devised in a racist way that still continue to have a disproportionately negative impact on one group of people or the other along the lines of race, you can make an argument and say that that sort of racism is maybe still a thing, because what is true is that if you are part of this disproportionately large percentage of Black America, say 20 or 30%, that it lives in poverty, you live in a multi-generational poverty, ensconced in particularly urban environments that people were effectively locked into through redlining, through the construction of the federal highway system, in context where through the insourcing of immigration and through the outsourcing of manufacturing jobs, these places became essentially job deserts into which came drugs, came welfare, and an economy where there weren't job opportunities, but there are opportunities for public dependence that then in that context created a sort of a cauldron in which you had gang violence, people competing over the drug trade, into which you develop the phenomenon of mass incarceration. All of these things sort of conspired to create a reality of practical subjugation, even if nobody was consciously intending for that to be the case post civil rights movement, right?
Right.
And so that's what I mean by the legacy of racism having intensified. And yet, it's much more likely that, all of our major institutions are integrated. Black people and white people are much more likely to live in the same neighborhoods and send their kids to the same schools, as would have been the case, going back prior to the civil rights movement. And so there's a great deal more social tolerance across racial lines, but that exists in tension with this sort of systemic reality. And so if you have cultural issues in Black America, if you do have higher rates of let's say illegitimacy, children born out of wedlock, to take an anachronistic term, or higher rates of homicide or criminal activity, higher rates of incarceration, lower rates of education, it is an outgrowth of these structures. But it doesn't mean that personal responsibility and community level agency is still not the most direct response to some of those problems. The truth is we need both of these things. We need systemic reform, but you also need community and grassroots level work to be able to impact people at the point at which these problems start to develop. So there's a sociologist named Patrick Sharkey who wrote a book, a number of great books. One of them was a book called Uneasy Peace, about the history of policing in inner city and Black communities. And he produces a fair amount of data to show that community level impact organizations do a disproportionate amount of good for the number of dollars that are invested in them. But at the same time, the scale of the problem of poverty and violence in communities are such that, in his opinion, it would require federal level investment to be able to reach the problem in its breadth. But you still need community level investment to be able to impact the problem where it's deepest, right?
Yeah.
And so you need civil society, you need philanthropy, you need business, you need ministries, and you also need the federal government to be involved, which means you need progressives and conservatives. You need Democrats and Republicans, right? And we need to not have to choose between one storyline or the other if we're going to be able to solve both sides of the coin.